Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. This is Mike Hirschberg from the Vertical Flight Society, and today we have Yolanka Wulff and Dietrich from the Community Air Mobility Initiative who will be speaking to us. So, Yolanka?
Thank you, and thanks for joining us. Anna and I are really excited to do this webinar, webcast. So, as Mike said, we are the co-executive directors of the Community Air Mobility Initiative. We'll talk a little bit more about our organization later, but we want to start off by talking about urban air mobility, adding the third dimension to urban and regional transportation, and why this is important to us and why we organized CAMI to help support this. Next slide. So technology is redefining flight. We've got 4 principal tech drivers that are bringing us to the third revolution in aviation. And that is the electrification of propulsion, the development of more autonomous systems, the use of mobility as a service, which we're certainly seeing on the ground and which we will see translated to flight, and increased communication capability with 5G. And those capabilities, those tech drivers have brought us new vehicles. And in aviation, we see the development of electric and hybrid fixed wings, as well as eVTOLs, electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. These aircraft are able to help us move people, move goods, and automate tasks. And through that, what we see is that the lowered cost of maintaining and operating these aircraft open up short routes. They increase the number of access points we have. They stimulate demand for air travel where ground travel is being used today. Next slide. So what is urban air mobility? The term is being used more and more these days. Different people have different ideas of what that means, but for us at CAMI, urban air mobility is the use of the three-dimensional transportation to better serve the needs of our communities. It integrates with existing metropolitan transportation systems. In some aspects, this is nothing new. We've been using regional airline travel and helicopter services for a long time. But in other ways, this is completely new. The new eVTOL aircraft enable different missions, different routes, as well as the electric fixed wing, and they make air travel safer, quieter, greener, and more economical. Next slide. At CAMI, we envision a number of zones of operation and styles of operation. So the one that comes to mind for most people with urban air mobility is the city center, going from a dense urban area to another place in that dense urban area or another urban area. But there are other routes, missions as well. So from the suburbs to the city, this is akin to what many people today use in their commute using transit, light rail. Connecting edge cities. These are cities that in the day of that regional aircraft could still afford to fly, were connected via their small airports. Today, with the increased cost of fossil fuels, those cities are no longer connected by aviation. Rural access is also an important mission for urban air mobility. Rural areas often have lower economic demographics. They have aging populations, and travel over ground can take a long time. So these are important areas to bring air mobility to. And then finally, access to hub airports from suburbs, from cities, from all different locations. We can see that these aircraft can operate in different ways. They can operate like a scheduled airline with scheduled routes, more like an air metro. This would be akin to a bus route that travels on a consistent basis with people getting on and off. Certainly on demand, connecting to mobility as a service, operating as an airport shuttle, and importantly, emergency services. Next slide. So quick baseline on electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. eVTOL aircraft use drone technology, like electric motors, to take off and land vertically and fly horizontally. As you can see on the slide, the benefits of eVTOL include being sustainable, quiet, safe, affordable, and community friendly. And again, they're used for passenger travel, cargo delivery, and essential and emergency services. In the scheme of urban air mobility that CAMI works with, we are not working with small drones. Obviously, urban air mobility aircraft need to integrate with UAS, but that's not within CAMI's mission to integrate with that use case. Next slide. So a few statistics about urban air mobility. The industry is projected to be $1.5 trillion by 2040, making it the single largest new industry to emerge this generation. Hybrid electric travel industry could reach $178 billion by 2028, and the world's drone use for industrial purposes will reach $40 billion by 2023. Next slide. In 2017, there were 12 known companies developing eVTOL aircraft. Today, there are at least 225 eVTOL aircraft, with a dozen at some stage in the process of FAA certification. And in 2019 alone, there were over 1,000 test flights of full-size eVTOL aircraft. Next slide. Another key metric is the entrance of automotive OEMs into this space. We see a number of these OEMs have partnered with either large aviation OEMs or startups to enter the space. We see this as significant for two reasons. One, it's a large influx of resources, but also urban air mobility in its scaled up version, it will be much more akin to automotive operations, both in the volume of operations as well as the scale of manufacturing. So this is important expertise to bring into this new industry. Next slide. One of the key areas that CAMI is focusing on are the social and economic impacts of urban air mobility. People are willing to spend up to 60 minutes for their daily commute. This is known as Marchettis Constant, and it has existed since humans have existed. So what happens as we improve technology for transportation is not that we reduce congestion on the streets, but we increase the distance that people can travel on a daily commute. UAM has the potential to increase that radius to 200 miles. So the important piece is that we're saving people time by allowing them to live further from their place of work. UAM can leapfrog infrastructure projects and geographic constraints to enable that to happen in a way that ground transportation cannot. And it brings housing options closer to the economic centers. Next slide. There are a number of challenges to urban air mobility implementation. Technology certainly is one, but we've seen a lot of progress in technology over the last couple of years, as witnessed by the number of dollars going in, the number of aircraft that have been developed. Regulation certification, again, another area that has the potential to slow things down, but through the standards development organizations and the FAA and other CAAs, we've seen a lot of progress on this front as well. Other challenges to UAM implementation include the infrastructure. Infrastructure has the potential to be a barrier in terms of rollout of this industry. This includes everything from vertiport design and construction to charging infrastructure and grid management and integration with existing metropolitan transportation systems. Air traffic management is another challenge. Again, there are smart people working on this, including NASA with their CONOPS project, Concept of Operations project, to understand how we manage air traffic in a dense metropolitan area, integrating with existing air traffic, but also understanding that we're moving towards a high volume of aircraft in a very small space. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for us, certainly, is the question of public acceptance. None of this makes any difference or helps if the public don't accept these aircraft as a form of transportation. Next slide, please. This quote was in a McKinsey report a few years ago referring to the drone industry, but it is equally applicable to urban air mobility. The future of the industry is still up for debate in many ways, since it depends on 5 factors. First, and perhaps most vital, is the issue of public acceptance. The industry has to build a lot of confidence before people will accept thousands of them flying overhead or board UAS air taxis. And I think we have seen within the UAM industry over the last 2 years that over and over public acceptance community acceptance has risen to the top of concerns in terms of the development of this industry moving forward. Next slide. One of the big questions that comes up when we talk about public acceptance is noise. It's where most engineers' heads go to solve public acceptance. And at CAMI, we like to say that noise is, solving the noise issue is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's part of the public acceptance issue, but it's not the only piece. So there are really 3 critical factors to achieve public acceptance. The first is safety. The public has to believe that these aircraft are safe, both to fly in them and to allow them to fly over their communities. The second aspect is public benefit. The communities have to see that these aircraft benefit them. So having aircraft that are simply flying limos for the rich will not bring us to public acceptance. These need to be a working part of a larger metropolitan transportation system that makes sense for the general public. And finally, the third critical factor is limited adverse impact. Here again is where you see noise, also visual impact and emissions. So to achieve public acceptance on all 3 of these issues, we need full and transparent engagement between the UAM industry, the regulators, and community members. Next slide. One of the important things to understand about noise is that it's not just a decibel level measurement. We can't just say these aircraft need to be X decibels quieter than they are today, or X decibels quieter than helicopters. The perceived value of the thing making the noise is critical to whether it's perceived as too loud by the community. So these non-acoustic factors are extremely important to take into consideration. These are, for instance, when any of us see a helicopter fly low overhead, that's a medical helicopter flying to the hospital. The first thought is not, oh, that helicopter is loud. We all recognize the value and importance of having airlift operations. That's a simple example. Again, if the public can see the benefit to themselves and to the community of having aircraft like this, it's a lot easier lift in terms of public acceptance. Next slide. So again, because we're looking at a number of non-acoustic factors, such as the value to the public, the timing of the aircraft flying overhead, the sequencing, it's a much more complicated question than simply the decibel level. So it's not about setting a specific level. It's about understanding and having a conversation with the community to plan for how these aircraft will fly, when they'll fly, in what volumes they'll fly. Next slide. And we have to get this issue right to get the political support to introduce urban air mobility into municipalities. This is going to be a sticky issue and a place where we're going to see pushback right away from local elected officials. Next slide. So, are cities prepared for this? Typical transportation plans in metropolitan areas have a 10 to 20-year planning window. For urban air mobility to roll out in the time frame that many of the manufacturers are talking about, cities have to be incorporating these plans into their transportation plans and comprehensive plans now. And that is why it's so important that we address public acceptance. Next slide, please. This is what we like to call the cast of characters. It's the probably not all, but a lot of the stakeholders that are involved in this discussion. Up till now, it's been primarily the UAM industry. And as you can see, there's a broad range. We've got everything from airports and transportation departments to real estate developers, state and local governments, federal regulators, insurance companies, essential services, and of course the public. The conversation needs to be broad, and it needs to include all of these people. Next slide. One of the pieces that we like to emphasize is that the industry itself is taking a crawl, walk, run approach to adopting urban air mobility, and that will be important for public acceptance. It's important for technology, proving out technology. It's important for developing air traffic management and infrastructure, but it's also important for public acceptance, that the public sees some actual demonstrations, begins to understand how urban air mobility will benefit their community. Next slide. So, community leaders that aren't planning today for the inevitable third dimension of transportation will be chasing it when it arrives. Next slide. And I think I will stop here and let Anna jump in for the rest of the presentation. And again, I will stay on as long as I can for questions.
Thanks, Yolanka. So all of that is a fantastic preamble to why we're doing what we're doing. To get this right, we need to have a voice in this space that is focused on educating and supporting these people that have to make very critical decisions for how urban air mobility will be integrated into communities and into transportation landscapes around the country and the world. So the Community Air Mobility Initiative, CAMI for short, has been created to be that educational voice. So we are focused at the state and local level. There's already good work happening at the federal level. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that currently is supported by the organizations that you see on the slide here, and are continuing to build our resources and look for ways to increase our impact and support in these areas. I will say that we started in mid-2019, and we're looking forward to having our first official programming coming up later this month. So hopefully we'll be able to continue to build on that momentum. One of the first resources that we've produced is something that I'm particularly excited about, as there's so many different terms that get tossed around in terms of urban air mobility and what it means. The term advanced air mobility is often used, and I think that might be as appropriate, if not a little bit more so, for how we're talking about using these aircraft and these zones of operations and styles of operations that Yolanka described previously. So this is some screenshots of a PDF that is now available on the CAMI website. There'll be many more of these documents coming over the coming months. And the goal here is simply to provide, like I said, resources for folks that haven't been living and breathing in this space for the time that many of us have, but rather are coming at this with questions, and they're good questions. And we need to all be speaking the same language and talking about the same things to have constructive conversations going forward. We're also working with NASA. They're taking a leadership role in the urban air mobility and advanced air mobility space, both, as Yolanka mentioned, on the airspace integration side, but also by participating in standards development activities with ASTM and other standards development organizations, and other foundational research and working groups that's necessary to mature this industry. So we're excited to be partnering with them, particularly around a community planning tool to look at how adding this third dimension and adding these aircraft into your transportation landscape would impact travel and transportation more broadly within a community, integrating with other modes of transportation, that sort of thing. So stay tuned for more on that in the coming months as well. The first event that I mentioned, here's some more information about it. So we are putting on what we're calling UAM 101 in conjunction with the Vertical Flight Society infrastructure workshop that's coming up in a couple of weeks. Our intention here is to provide foundational knowledge for these state and local decision makers and others that are fairly new to this industry, that are coming at this knowing that they need to understand this space in order to be effective at their planning tasks going forward and at their jobs more broadly as they consider where things are headed, but really don't necessarily have deep familiarity with what urban air mobility is. So we'll be looking at providing that basic context, introduction to what these aircraft are, what they do, and then how they connect to existing and new infrastructure, legal and insurance issues associated with operating them in a community, and then looking forward to what we can do to influence development on a local level, how this gets integrated into the existing transportation landscape, and then touching back into some tools and resources that are available, including an introduction to that NASA tool that I mentioned previously. And as I said, this is in conjunction with the Vertical Flight Society workshop, so very excited for both of those. And ideally, someone that is new to the space would be able to get brought up to speed on Monday afternoon and then dive in with both feet starting on Tuesday morning. We're very much taking a collaborative approach. As I said, we'll be adding more and more resources to the website, including presentation recordings from our UAM 101 event. and additional PDF resources and other blog posts and that sort of thing will continue to be built out there as well. We also have a newsletter you can sign up for, and are always interested in having conversations with organizations or individuals that are interested in supporting our mission. And of course, education and communication is central to that mission. So if there's an opportunity to present or to have a discussion or to support a conversation in this space, we'd be happy to have that conversation. We really are here, as we say, we're here to help people and communities take to the skies. We really do believe that this is the next step of where transportation is going, and we would like to see communities and society at large really be in the driver's seat for this and doing the things in a way that maximizes the potential utility for this technology, as opposed to playing catch up sort of once the horse is fully out of the barn. So I think that is what we've prepared for this morning, and would be happy to take questions at this time.
Well, thank you very much, Anna and Yolanka, for that fantastic presentation. This is Brian Garrett-Glaser from Aviation Today, and I am going to, I guess, be stepping into the moderator role here to start off with a couple of questions and then look to the chat for more. So to everybody else on the call, please go ahead and type questions in the chat, and I'll pull from those and pose them to CAMI here. So thank you both again very much, and I'll start by asking, could you give us a sense of who it is that you're typically engaging with? And by that, I mean, what organizations and what kind of job functions?
So it's really been quite varied so far. And we are trying to connect going in both directions, if that makes sense, to have a dialogue between the UAM ecosystem and the local players. So it has been state departments of transportation, and city planners on the one hand, and then organizations like NASA and other industry players on the other. So trying to build those bridges of connecting the dots and ensuring that the right people are talking to the right people and getting the information that they need. But I would say the majority of our conversations to date, at least from my perspective, and Yolanka may want to correct me on this, but have been at the state DOT level. And I think as things become ever more real, there'll be more and more individual communities that are interested. The one piece that I should add to that is actually local airports. Community airports have also been very interested in the potential for urban air mobility and electrified aviation to sort of revitalize their experience.
Yeah, I think Anna, you've hit it right on the head. I was going to add community airports, that you just did that. I think we have also had conversations with some of the larger regional transportation projects. For example, the Cascadia Innovation Corridor, which is a project that runs from Vancouver, British Columbia to Portland. It's a planning group that's been together for a while now, looking at concepts like high-speed rail, but really looking at that larger regional area, and that are now realizing that urban air mobility, that third dimension, is something they need to be considering.
Okay, and I'll start to pull a few questions from the chat here that I think segue pretty well. What kind of level of knowledge and understanding of UAM have you encountered so far? Well, I'll start with that one and follow up later.
So this is Yolanka. I would say everything from absolutely no knowledge on up. So, for instance, yesterday I spoke at the UC Davis Aviation Noise and Emissions Symposium, which is, a fantastic conference. A lot of really smart people that are involved in noise and emissions in aviation. And when I spoke about urban air mobility, I saw a lot of deer in the headlights looks, and people who came up to me afterwards that said they just had no idea this was going on. And I think, as I said, it goes up from there. There are certainly state DOTs that are leaning forward into this, that North Carolina already had a demonstration flight, for example. So it's a variety, but probably when you look at the planners level, more municipal level, there are a lot of people who are not aware that this is happening.
Right. Sorry, Anna, did you want to add anything, or should I move to the next question?
No, I think that was very well said. There's a huge spectrum of awareness and knowledge, and yeah, folks that are absolute domain experts in their particular areas haven't heard that this is happening. So definitely a need for sort of foundational education.
Right. So once the foundational education is complete, or at least started, and people have an idea of what we're talking about here, what are the kinds of reactions that you get then? And I'll add to that, what are usually brought up as the biggest obstacles or the biggest pushback, elements of pushback that people mention?
I'll start with that. I think a lot of the initial pushback comes if we haven't been able to adequately describe the crawl, walk, run progression that Yolanka described. So folks that think that this is going from 0 to 60 overnight tend to both be much more resistant to it in general, as well as much more convinced that it simply won't work. I think when you have a more nuanced understanding of that we already have a functional, safe, healthy general aviation industry in place today that just most people don't interact with on a daily basis, and that we can start by using those operational constructs and that infrastructure and those certification pathways and all of you know, the whole package around that in a limited way to start getting operational experience with these aircraft and with these missions, and then to grow from there. I think you start seeing a lot more of the, yeah, okay, I can see how that could work. And I like to draw a parallel to the initial days of the automotive industry, because when cars first started being mass produced, there were a lot of cities and towns that would require you to hire somebody to literally walk in the road in front of your car to ensure that you didn't drive too fast. Walking speed was what was considered the appropriate speed to drive. So when we went from that to you know, freeways and interstate tolling and stoplights and the whole, you know, the whole package that we have today to facilitate automotive travel. So, and none of that, you know, you didn't flip a switch and suddenly go from one to the other. So I think there'll be a progression, much like there was for the automotive industry. The opportunity and the difference here is that we get to drive that progression in a direction that is beneficial to as many facets of society as possible, and is done as safely and as efficiently as possible, as opposed to being reactionary, which a lot of the automotive infrastructure ended up being reactionary. So we can get ahead of it if we act now, which is great. But to actually go back to your question, I think it really comes down to understanding the reality versus the science fiction, and the vision of 10,000s of these flying around your city tomorrow can be kind of terrifying. But the idea that you could start with some emergency response services or some limited micro haul sort of airline model activities in the next couple of years and have that be almost not noticeable in the grand scheme of things, and then grow from there, that tends to get a much more positive reception, which is much more closer to the truth, in my opinion, for how we'll see this progress.
Mm-hmm.
And Brian, this is Yolanka. I completely agree with Anna, and I would just add that the other initial pushback that we get is that this is something that will be for the 0.1%. So I think that's where those understanding the public benefits piece is so critical. Understanding that, yes, initially there probably will be higher costs because it's a startup industry, but the movement is towards a functioning part of a larger metropolitan transportation system.
Got it. One more point along the same vein. What kind of misconceptions do you usually encounter? You mentioned, sort of 0 to 100, there's going to be thousands of these flying tomorrow. Other than that, from the people that have maybe heard or read an article or two, what are the kind of misconceptions that you encounter?
One that I see pretty regularly is that these are going to be flying without any sort of human oversight or intervention. And I think that that's just simply not true. There's a number of concepts that are being designed to have an onboard pilot or operator. So there would actually be a human on board the aircraft that's responsible for that aircraft. Even the concepts that are being designed without someone actually on board the aircraft, they still have a remote pilot or remote operator. So there's still someone whose job it is to look after that aircraft. It's not just kind of push the green button and away it goes and everybody goes back to eating their lunch. So it is something where there is someone who is, responsible and aware and engaged in the operation of that aircraft. Whether that person is on board the aircraft or not is a design choice that is being made in different ways. But the vision of the computer is just completely in charge without any oversight is one that's far enough away that I don't even want to speculate on when we might get there if we ever do. So I think that the idea of just handing the keys over to the computer is something that's scary to people, but it's also not something that realistically is going to happen in the near future.
And I would add to that, another misconception is that a lot of these aircraft are going to be privately owned and operated as opposed to being parts of a fleet of aircraft operated by an airline operator. So again, the idea that all of these aircraft are aircraft that are coming from people's yards, from their driveways to their workplace, rather than coming from a major transportation hub like a light rail station in the suburbs, or a hub airport into maybe a more urban, congregated landing area.
Right. Okay. A question from the chat is, in terms of, and this is going along the lines of discussing autonomy, in terms of public acceptance, do you feel that autonomous operations will be a harder sell than piloted flights? And I would kind of add to that question, from what you said previously, it sounds like there's some, almost like the two are wrapped up, are being interpreted as together, UAM and autonomy. Some people are seeing them both come across together. Is that kind of the, are you getting that perception? And do you think that's maybe almost problematic? Is that making it more difficult for people to understand UAM?
They are certainly closely connected, autonomy and urban air mobility, and I don't think that's entirely inappropriate. I mean, we already have a lot of autonomy in our life, and we have a lot of automation in our life, and I think on the whole it makes things safer. So, having lane keep assist or adaptive cruise control in your car, automatic braking, all of those things would be considered autonomy or high levels of automation in their limited niche for their function. And we have things like envelope protection and automatic ground collision avoidance that's been deployed on our military aircraft that's already saved a number of lives with fighter jets. Pilot loses the ability to control the aircraft. The automatic ground collision system keeps it from flying into the ground, maintains straight and level flight until the pilot can regain control. So there's already systems like this in place that I don't think people are fully aware of or have just incorporated into their lives in ways that they may or may not be really aware that they're using an autonomous system. So I think that, again, it comes back to the crawl, walk, run approach. And if we can do a gradual sort of proof of appropriateness for the technology, I think we'll have a much easier road to pave in terms of getting it accepted. If we try to do too much too fast and there's a few high-profile incidents, then obviously that will pose a much greater challenge. So I think if it's responsibly rolled out and people understand the benefits as well as the novelty and the risks that are associated with that novelty, I think you can get to acceptance there. But the idea of, again, is, the idea of completely automated, no one's looking at it at all, fully autonomous operations, that's not really what we're talking about either. So while I think that there's some psychological barriers to that, I think the simplified vehicle operations in which you use autonomy to make it easier for the pilot and safer for the aircraft to fly, I think that will gain acceptance fairly easily once it's understood. And I think even the remote operation once it's really understood that no, there's an operator here in the loop, they're just not in the aircraft, I think that will go a long way too. So so yeah, the fully automated, like I said before, handing the keys to the computer, I think there's a barrier there. And I think because of its association with urban air mobility, and because of, you know, some people calling these passenger drones and that sort of thing, it sort of cements that conception of these being not terribly safe, highly autonomous toy things that you're now going to get on. So I don't like that term, if you couldn't tell. I think there's some challenges there, but the actual understanding of the technology and what's being proposed, I think people can wrap their heads around.
Got it. So when you talk to these urban planners, city folks, and also local and regional airports, how do they see what are the initial use cases that they see for urban air mobility? What are they most excited about? And how do they think this is initially going to roll out?
I have one from talking with a major metropolitan area that is facing chronic underutilization of their light rail system with chronic overutilization of pretty much everything else. And they are excited about the possibility of coupling sort of an air metro style operation, potentially with some on-demand as well, with their light rail system, so that you maybe 8 or 9 days out of 10 take the train, but then on those 1 or 2 days where something comes up that is particularly urgent, your kid gets sick at school and you have to get home to pick them up or something like that, you're no longer constrained by what could be perceived as a limiting schedule for the light rail system. But you can hop in an eVTOL aircraft and get home quickly and when you need to, as opposed to being stuck to waiting for, you know, rush hour to come around again for the trains to be running regularly. So that's one application that I thought was particularly ingenious in that it addresses one of the psychological and practical barriers to using existing infrastructure without, you know, having to build out a whole new system or dramatically change how that light rail system is running, but simply to supplement, to provide that not necessarily emergency use, but urgency use with the urban air mobility. So that's one use case that I think is particularly neat to, you know, use the infrastructure that's already been built. Others include emergency services or access to extremely geographically remote areas, particularly in communities that are on water and have peninsulas, and it takes, you know, you have to drive, it's a very long way to drive all the way around kind of thing, that maybe have ferry service, but maybe that's not adequate or fast enough for some use cases. So accessing those otherwise underserved communities is another one that I think has particular promise for an early application. And then emergency services in general, I think there's a lot of potential there, both in terms of first responder insertion and medical evacuation. The list is long. Yeah, go ahead, Yolanka.
I was going to say, I'll make a comment. I'm actually in my seat on the aircraft. It's boarding now, so this may be my last one. Another kind of early or high interest area that I've run into is the recognition that this will roll out faster than some very high capital infrastructure intensive alternatives like high-speed rail, and that and recognizing that there's a political challenge there when you have elected officials and government that has been planning for a high-speed rail corridor for a long time. They've allocated dollars and time and energy to that project, and because they're very long projects to develop and build, it may make more sense to just leapfrog that project and move to urban mobility. So I think we will see some tension in the political government finance areas where people who have been invested in one particular solution may see those solutions leapfrogged by this.
Got it. Thank you very much, Yolanka, for joining. Hope you have a safe flight. If this is the last time we hear from you.
Okay. I'll hang on as long as I can.
Sounds good. Great. We're happy to have you, obviously. How would you compare the engagements at different levels of government seen in the US versus other governments around the world, particularly Japan, South Korea, Singapore, some of the Asian nations?
It's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have a really good answer for it. We haven't been directly involved in the international engagements to this point, so I can't speak from firsthand experience about the differences there. I think in general, the US regulatory approach has been much more of a case-by-case one than what I've seen on some of the international levels, but that's really more on the aircraft certification side. I think that does carry forward into sort of finding a solution for each municipality or each area on its own as well. So I would say the little bit that I can speak to that comparison, I tend to see more handling things as one-offs on the US side and a little bit more of a sweeping one-size-fits-all solution internationally, but that's a gross generalization, so I wouldn't put too much into that.
Okay. What can eVTOL developers do or avoid doing to help build understanding and acceptance with communities?
I'll jump in on this since I still can. I think one of the things that eVTOL developers can do is enter the conversation and recognize that that this is a two-way conversation. I think one of the interesting kind of social, psychological pieces of this industry is that up until now, aviation has lived in its own bubble from an industry perspective and also from a public commercial use perspective. So, I think about my trip to San Diego Airport this morning. I took an Uber, but as I entered the airport grounds, I got out and I entered the airport terminal. I went through security, and now I'm in an area that's completely dedicated to aviation, and I will be until I land at SeaTac and get back in an Uber and re-enter the rest of the metropolitan transportation system. When we're talking about urban air mobility, we're talking about an intimate integration of air travel into people's daily lives, into that transportation system. So where aviation, the industry has had the luxury of designing aircraft and operations within its own industry, it now has to understand that it needs to have this conversation with both the metropolitan planning departments and elected officials and state departments of transportation, as well as the community acceptance, and it needs to listen to what those communities need. And those communities are going to vary greatly. It's a little different than the hub airports that we have now. This is going into very different communities, different in terms of demographics, in terms of economies, in terms of weather and geographical constraints, population size. There's so many variables. So I think that those are some of the pieces that these new companies developing developing eVTOLs need to understand. They can't stay in their silo.
I agree completely with that. I would also add that there has to be a balance between hype and realism. Without the bold visions and some of the hype, it's hard to get momentum to move forward. So I appreciate the role that plays. But at the same time, as we were talking about before, sometimes that can be kind of terrifying to people that aren't already comfortable with the space. So I think having a sort of balanced and rational approach to and message around just what it is we're going to be able to do by when is important. So I would say that's sort of the other piece of it. Consider that maybe not everybody thinks this is amazing right off the bat, and they may need some time to get up to speed with what it is and get comfortable with it, and suggesting that they're going to be thrown into the deep end feet first on the course of a few months or a year, even a few years. If you're talking about 10 to 20 year planning cycles, that's a little bit much. So I think focusing on the potential and the promise while also being realistic about the measured approach with which we're going to be rolling this out and how we're going to be leveraging the systems that are already in place for general aviation today that are working well today are going to help us get there. I think that's a nice balance to strike if possible.
I think I'll do maybe 2 more questions and then we'll wrap this up as we're getting pretty close to the hour mark here. So one is, most aerospace OEMs are B2B, they're in a B2B business and historically rely on the airline customers to cultivate business to consumer relationships. How does this change? How is this different for UAM? Do eVTOL customers currently exist other than Uber? Is this a challenge that people in the UAM space are thinking about? I'm not phrasing this properly, but there's a difference between the typical B2B relationship for the aerospace world, right, and the idea of how these UAM aircraft are going to be used and who the end consumers are, and the relationship between the creators of the aircraft and the users. How's that unfolding? Is this a challenge?
That's a really good question. I don't think that it's going to be as fundamentally different as maybe we think. So if we look at Lyft and Uber with cars, with ground transportation, they are relying on individuals who own their own vehicles and do all of their own maintenance to just sort of tap into this network whenever they feel like it to provide this service. That doesn't work for aviation. So we're not going to see a model in which you have a highly dispersed set of individual owners operating their aircraft either for their own personal use or kind of on this ad hoc sort of basis. There's too many requirements around what it means to be an aircraft operator and what it means to do aircraft maintenance to make that sort of dispersed ownership, individual ad hoc model work in this space. So it's going to end up being some sort of a B2B model, or it's going to be a vertically integrated model. So I think there will be operators that, similar to the Part 135 operators in existence today, that either incorporate eVTOL aircraft into their existing operations or are stood up for the purpose of providing eVTOL services. So I think that will look fairly similar, actually. And then I also see some real interest in some of the vehicle manufacturers vertically integrating and having operations and maintenance and all of those pieces be part of their, if not their core business, then a tightly held sister organization, so that there's a lot of efficiencies to be gained there and a lot of safety to be gained there potentially by tightly integrating the aircraft maintenance and operations and design and manufacturing, all of those pieces. So I think we'll see more vertical integration. I think we will still see aircraft operators, and I don't think the individual owner operator model is one that we'll see, at least not at scale.
I agree with Anna, and I'd say there's one other interesting piece that I think we will see unfold, and that has to do with autonomy. As the vehicles become more autonomous, we start to see more blending of the manufacturing and operating functions, and there could be some interesting liability issues around that. And insurance questions in terms of responsible parties. So I think that's kind of a next layer, but I think that the fact that these vehicles are will become more autonomous can lead to some new issues for the industry to consider.
Got it. I'll ask one final question, and then I think Mike Hirschberg will wrap this up. How are cities approaching, or what's the sense that you get from speaking with people about infrastructure ownership in cities? public versus private funding models, and how cities and communities are going to feel about, for example, if Uber wants to own all of the infrastructure and have it be exclusive to them, what are the reactions you're getting about these sorts of questions?
I'll jump in first. And I would say, first of all, I think what we're going to see are different answers in different communities. But in general, I think what we're seeing from the municipal level and state level is that as planners and elected officials and decision makers come to understand that this is a real piece of their transportation system, they also recognize that they need to have control and decision-making power about where these vertiports will be located. So, as I mentioned before, it makes a lot of sense to co-locate a vertiport with a major transportation hub like a light rail station. It does not make sense to stick vertiports on top of buildings that just because the owner of the building thought it would be a good revenue generator. If that building, for instance, is located on a street that's a through bus lane, so you'll have no ability to manage curb space and drop off and pick up passengers. So I think the question of who operates and owns the vertiports is a really interesting one. I think what we're going to see is that there's going to be a lot of interest on the part of elected officials to make sure that these vertiports are located in places that serve the public interest and not private operations. That said, I think that we're also seeing that public-private partnerships may become a strong model for how these are owned. I'm not sure that we're going to see a lot of municipalities that actually want to own and operate the vertiports, but they certainly want some control over where they're located and how they integrate with the rest of their transportation system.
Okay, if that's, I don't know, Anna, do you want to add to that, or are we ready to wrap up here?
I think that was well said. I think there will be one of the advantages of starting the conversation now with communities and with planners is that it gives them the ability to potentially have some leverage over that conversation. So if there's a permitting question for a private vertiport in one area of their community, perhaps coupled with that is a vertiport in another area of the community that might have more public good, but potentially less profit margins. So it gives communities an opportunity to be more deliberate about it by having these conversations today. But I think, as Yolanka said, each community will come up with its own approach here, and we'll see probably a pretty wide variety of everything from a desire to really have this be a publicly subsidized transit resource to no, we're not spending public dollars on this, basically do what you want with the limits. So I think there'll be a very wide spectrum of approaches to that question. And I think it's a question that is central to whether or not this ultimately ends up being as useful as it can be to as many people as possible.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much to both of you, Anna, Yolanka. Once again, safe flight. Thanks everybody for joining, and I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Great. Thanks, Brian, and thank you, Anna and Yolanka, very much for that insightful presentation. Thank you all for your questions, and I think it was a very informative discussion. And just as mentioned before, we plan to have a series of these, so I appreciate you guys being the first off, and we'll probably have the next one will be with Uber in a few weeks. So we hope everyone will be able to join us again for that. So thank you again, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.